Hey guys, this is Pete Clark and welcome to the start of your Carrot Poker School journey. This is Grade 1, Lecture 1, and in today's class we're going to be discussing equity and EV. Now these might sound like fairly basic concepts to you, but rest assured that we're going to be exploring these concepts today in a more complex way that relates to the function that these concepts have in poker overall. Having fundamental leaks in this respect, having any misconceptions about exactly how equity and EV work in poker and relate to one another can be one of the biggest roadblocks in the journey to getting better at this tricky game. So let's get into it. I hope you enjoy the lecture. We'll be running for around an hour to an hour and a half in all of our classes. We'll be doing a summary at the end. You will find a homework exercise at the end of the lecture, and it's very possible that I will ask you to pause throughout this course to try to solve exercises on your own before revealing the answer. I would recommend that you try to follow along and take part in these exercises proactively as we progress, as this will allow you to get more out of the course. We're going to begin with a true or false exercise, which you can do on your own with peers. Please feel free to pause the video during this exercise and attempt it yourself before I reveal the answers. The following statements are about equity and EV. These ones are about equity. The next slide we'll move on to talking about EV. And I want you to read them as we go here and have a think about whether they are true or false. You can pause the video at this point. Make sure that you've read all of these statements, written down an answer, and possibly written down a little bit about why you think each is true or false. Okay, I will now assume that you've paused, attempted the exercise yourself, and now unpaused. This first one is false. Your equity describes how often you will win the pot is not a very good statement about equity. The problem with this is that hands of poker go down in very many different ways. Sometimes somebody folds, sometimes you win lots more money than is currently in the pot, so it's not really very relevant whether you're winning the pot or not. What might be more important is how much you're winning. But equity doesn't even describe how often you will win the pot because it only shows you how often you win if the hand were to go to showdown. Your equity is basically your hand's power against your opponent's hand or range. You can look at equity, hand versus hand, hand versus range, range versus hand, or range versus range. And in any case, it's just going to show you a hypothetical value, how often you would win the pot if you were to go to showdown. And of course, that doesn't always happen. You can't always realize all of your equity. This one is certainly true. Any time that your hand has to fold before the river, some of your equity will go unrealized. And as we'll see later, there are many types of hand that do a better job of this than others. Some hands over-realize, meaning they're entitled to much more chips than their equity percentage of the pot would indicate, while others are entitled to far less chips. The equity of your hand is a major factor in determining what you should do. This is certainly true. Equity is not the only factor in a hand of poker, but it is the fundamental engine behind all of your decision making. When you have a very high equity hand, for example, it may be mandatory that you value bet and you might blunder by not value betting, depending on the spot. When you have a very low equity hand, it might mean that you can never bet, or it might mean that you have to bluff, depending on the spot. Again, equity will guide whether actions are permissible, prohibited, or mandatory at many stages in the game tree. And indeed, this three-pronged look at poker, whether you have to do things, can do things, or cannot do things, will form the fundamental basis of decision-making in Grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School. Your equity describes how profitable a play will be. This is false. Equity has nothing to do with profitability, rather it just shows you how often you would win in the hypothetical event of going to showdown, as I say. Therefore, it can't account for future bets that go into the pot, or money that you actually earn from your opponent's stack throughout the course of a hand. Equity has nothing to do with bluffing on the river. This is also false. If you have too much equity in a certain situation, it may be that bluffing is a big mistake. On the river, it's more lack of equity that's the relevant concept here, but typically equity has to be low enough in order for your hand to make more EV by bluffing than it would by checking. That's not to say that we bluff every hand that has no showdown value, no EV by checking. We will actually be setting a standard as to how little equity we need to bluff a river, depending on how well our range is doing, and also depending on whether we're in or out of position. We'll see this later. Equity is only a useful concept when you're making the final action of a hand. This is also completely false. While equity becomes more mathematical when you reach what we will refer to as an end of action spot, i.e. facing a river bet or all-in pre-river, in these situations equity can be injected into an equation, a call divided by total pot after call equation to see what the required win percentage is. So while equity is more precise on the river and functions in a more mathematically reliable way, it's very useful on other streets as well. Though admittedly its purpose there is a little bit more vague and is to do with estimation rather than calculation. Your equity is how often your hand would win versus your opponent's range if both players flipped their cards over and went to showdown. Absolutely. The clue here is in the word if. Equity is a hypothetical notion. Therefore, it can't really be the be-all and end-all of decision-making in any spot, while it is a large part of it. And finally, betting with low equity is almost always a bad idea. This is completely false. If this were true, we can actually reason via reductio ad absurdum here, which is where we reduce the validity of a proposition such as this one to absurdity by proving that if it were true, it would lead to some very bizarre consequences that are just untenable in our network of ideas. So betting with low equity being always a bad idea, or even almost always a bad idea, would imply that bluffing was not a thing that you could ever do. And right away we would have a complete contradiction as to how a lot of poker works. Very often in poker you have to bluff. There are a lot of mandatory bluff spots where if you don't bluff, you make a large error. And we'll look at lots of these in this course, especially in lecture 3. But bear with me for now, as we're now going to move on to discuss EV. Again, I would like you to read over the following statements briefly before thinking about each in a bit more detail and writing down an answer. Again, it's very important that you participate in this exercise explicitly where possible, speaking out loud, writing, typing on a notepad file. These are all very useful ways to go about solving this exercise. So, statements about EV. I will now assume that you have taken part in this exercise, written something down for each statement, had a think, and are ready to hear my summary. So, first statement, EV is a measure of the average monetary outcome of our choices in a hand. This is a very good definition of EV. This is exactly what EV is doing. It's basically expected value, I should say, is the long version of EV. And what expected value does is it basically averages out the expected win or loss in chips of an action, though this can also be expressed as a percentage of the pot, and shows you the net result expected for your hand with a certain set of circumstances in place based on the entire game tree and the average of the value of every branch within that game tree. We'll talk more later about how poker is a tree of possibilities. Statement 2, we can calculate our EV by doing mathematical sums in any spot. Absolutely not. Not only are the variables that lead to EV completely unknowable and basically opaque to humans because we don't have perfect information about our opponent's range, we don't even know how people are playing, and we certainly don't have the infinite processing power of an EV calculator or solver, whereby that application can actually explore the whole game tree in its entirety exhaustively and very quickly. We can't do that as humans, so no way can we use exact values when calculating EV. We can't calculate EV, we have to settle for the more human achievement of estimating it accurately enough that we can still choose the right decision from the wrong one. EV is estimated very roughly by weighing up the most relevant factors. This is absolutely right. Later today we're going to talk about how to determine which factors are relevant enough to be worthy of your time and consideration, and which factors you should reject due to their insignificance on the greater game tree. Number 4, our main goal in a hand is to find a play that is plus EV. This is a huge protocol error. If you live your life this way in poker, so to speak, you'll be frequently choosing any line that's profitable instead of trying to find the most profitable action. For example, if you have pocket aces in the cutoff pre-flop and you go all in for 100 big blinds cold, it's plus EV. In fact, very plus EV. It's probably winning something like 5 or 6 big blinds net, is my estimate. You can check that in your sims if you have a pre-flop solver. But the problem is that it's far from the best play. It's much more profitable to open smaller. EV considers factors that equity can't, such as fold equity and position. Absolutely. This is one of the main things that differentiates EV from equity, is that it has the ability to take these less numerical factors into account. Being in position will always increase your EV over being out of position. Having more fold equity will usually increase a hand's EV, although it will be the opposite in the case of a very strong hand that craves value. A hand can be entitled to less of the pot in EV than it has equity. Absolutely. Whenever you have to fold, your EV goes to 0. So if there's a percentage that you have to fold throughout the course of a hand, then there's a percentage in that hand of branches in the tree where EV becomes 0. Unless there are lots of branches where it's far greater than the equity, that hand will be entitled to less of the pot in EV than it has equity. This is very true of more mediocre average strength hands that crave showdown but can't really earn much in the form of value betting later. Your hand's EV is mostly to do with having more skill than your opponent. Absolutely not. I might be much better than someone at poker. It doesn't mean that I can open 8-7 off under the gun. Equity is a much more important factor than skill edge. That said, skill edge is very important, and it can frequently swing the EV of a pre-flop open, a flop c-bet, a turn call, all kinds of different spots, because the idea is that the future streets that still exist in the game tree are more in your favor when you have an edge. Therefore, pre-flop is actually one of the most important streets where edge comes into it, because there are more action points to come after that decision point. So it's very common to open hands that a pre-flop solver would say are slightly losing when you're playing with equal skill level like the solver is in its simulation, because maybe you think that the player in the big blind is much weaker than you, and therefore liable to make many more mistakes, and all of those mistakes go towards increasing your EV. It is indeed possible to have a hand that's worth 150% of the current pot in EV. The way to think about this is, imagine you had a pizza. This is like equity. You can't have more than 100% of your own pizza, because the max pizza you can have is 100% of it. But if you talked about having pizza in general, and you said, if I was to take Steve's pizza and Ellie's pizza as well, then I would have 300% of my pizza in pizza value, that makes sense. So for EV, there will very often be hands that, while they can't have more than 100% equity, their entitlement is 2 or 3 times the current pot. This is especially true of really strong hands, and it's especially true on small pots on early streets, where there's still a lot of scope to value bet later, check raise, put tons of money in, build a colossal sized pot. We can opt to take a lower EV line than an alternative line for balanced reasons. What did you think of this one? Well, this is actually false. Let me present a caveat here though. A solver will never do this. When there's equal skill edge and nobody is ever going to make any mistakes, it would not ever be viable to do this. In other words, there are no so-called loss leaders in poker. There are no hands that are sacrificing their own EV for the sake of the range in game theory. Rather, what we do is we try to maximize the EV of our range in an unexploitable way by maximizing the EV of every hand within that range. After all, a range is simply a family or collection of hands. So while this is not possible theoretically, and any attempt to do so would be a mistake that would only hurt the EV of your strategy through hurting the EV of one of its member hands, it's not completely impossible that there exists a human versus human scenario where, for example, if I limp the first hand, button versus big blind heads up, that my opponent makes bad assumptions about my skill level and starts overextending or making bad reads or plays in the future. It's not impossible that this could exist, but it's certainly not a theoretically palatable thing. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed those warm-up exercises. We're now going to get stuck into the meat of this lecture a little bit more, starting with the idea that equity ignores the effects of future bets. A lot of this lecture is going to be our quest to understand the main differences and similarities between equity and EV, so that we can use them in a more harmonious and fluid way. So equity is a rigid concept with quite limited scope. It cannot account for some very good hands earning more money, as we've talked about, than their equity share of the pot, nor can it account for some very bad hands earning less through having to fold and not having enough realizability of their equity. So let's meet the hand review format that this course, and indeed the entirety of the Carrot Poker School, will be using. Basically, we'll have a rough descriptor in yellow here above a flop. This shows you that it's a 3-bet pot, small blind against button. The out of position player will be on the left and the in position player will be on the right. Here we don't have any actions, but when actions are described in the Carrot Poker School, they will just form vertical columns down here. The turn would appear in this part of the slide and the river down below, with the actions check, bet with the explicit sizing used by the player here. So get used to this format. This is an extract from PioSolver. I'll very often be presenting little cutouts, copy and paste jobs from PioSolver, where I run the majority of my sims. This shows us that when small blind has kings here in this spot, 3-bet pot, small blind versus button, on this flop, then small blind's equity with this hand is 81.18%. This is a very high equity. It's something that we'll come to describe as a tier 2 hand, tier 2/1 hand in grade 2. But for now, just try and think about this hand as a very powerful holding. What do you think its EV is though? Pause the video and try and work out its EV, also expressed as a percentage of the current pot size. Well, the EV of this hand is actually 148% of the pot. That is possible, again, to reiterate, because we're thinking about making money externally from the pot as well. If I can have all of the pot plus some of your stack, then in total monetary gain there, I've gained more than 100% of the current pot. Just like I can take someone else's pizza and have 110% of my own pizza in pizza value. So it's common for very powerful hands to have far more EV than their equity. This is due to their implied odds, due to their ability to earn future bets and be in good shape when that happens. While this hand will lose sometimes, it's clearly very happy to increase pot size in this spot and get as much money in as possible throughout the course of the hand. On most runouts, the goal of this hand, indeed, is to get the whole stack in and maximize what it can earn. There are many ways of doing that though. That's not to say we have to bet. We're not at that point yet. Have a look at a hand like sixes. Imagine that the button here has pocket sixes. This is a mediocre to good hand in his range. As 7-4 deuce is a fairly friendly flop for sixes, pocket sixes are quite happy about this sort of situation. What that means is that they're going to have better than average equity, and their equity comes in at 58%. What do you think the EV will be of pocket sixes in this spot for button? And this is before he faces any action. We're not looking at facing a c-bet yet or anything like that. If you thought it'd be lower, you're absolutely correct. While very strong hands or draws to very strong hands typically harvest EV at a higher rate than their equity. That's to say they get a good conversion rate on that equity to EV translation. Bad hands like sixes actually get a very poor transfer rate. They get ripped off, so to speak. The reason this hand gets ripped off in its EV and is realizing only about 2/3 of its equity here in EV is that this hand will have to fold on many runouts and many action sequences. It's not guaranteed to know every time it's going to river a straight, river a set. It may not find out because it might be in the muck pile by then already. So that's disadvantageous for a hand like pocket sixes. This hand does retain most of its equity, and the reason for that is that it's in position. If we were to play this hand from out of position, maybe something like small blind versus big blind 3-bet pot, we'd probably see that the equity would get an even worse translation to EV. And it's very common for a player with a more marginal hand to have lower EV than their equity, and this is mainly due to the times that he or she has to fold and fail to realize that equity later on. Note that the EV of a hand can only be negative if someone makes a mistake. The lowest EV line GTO can ever accept is 0. And this is a very important point. In game theory, it would never be okay to have an EV for your hand that's a negative value. And the reason for that is that folding is always 0 from point of decision. Okay, sure, if you want to extend the lens back to pre-flop, you can say, well, I've lost my investment pre-flop here, but that's moving the focal point from which we're viewing the situation. We're not going back to the start of the hand and falling victim to the sunken cost fallacy that we have to defend our already invested money. That's not how pot odds work. Pot odds are just simply a ratio of the bet you're facing compared with the total pot. So what we really care about here is never making an investment that causes us to get back less than that investment. That's how EV works. So there will be absolutely no spot in GTO. And when I say GTO, guys, I don't mean some exact permutation of actions that a solver's recommending. I don't mean like following a solver. What I'm talking about here is just the theory of the game, the objective theory of poker. So the lowest EV line you can ever accept is 0, and sometimes 0 is the best EV you can have with sixes, and that entails folding because calling later would be worse. So this is why this hand gets back less EV than its equity would suggest. Another point here is that equity ignores the times that somebody folds. Equity is a hypothetical value. It only describes, as we said, how often your hand would win if you were to take the hand to showdown, and usually your human opponents are not so placid and harmonious to just allow everyone to show hands down all the time. There's a lot of betting that goes on in the limit hold'em for good reason. The theory of the game advocates a lot more aggression than a beginner player would be instinctively willing to commit to. So if someone folds, then equity no longer matters, right? If I have 35% equity but my cards are in the muck, it doesn't really matter anymore how much equity I have. Therefore, something that only describes events that could happen in the game tree and not events that will happen is an incomplete concept. And again, we're not arguing that equity is useless here. We're just saying that it has some very strict limitations. And this is because equity tells us nothing about how often we would lose the pot by having to fold, how often we win the pot by making villain fold, and it also tells us nothing about future investments, which we'll come to, earning value bets later on, or losing bets later on. So single raise pot here, big blind against button, 8-8-3 rainbow is your flop texture. Big blind starts with a check. As you can see, we just list these action sequences vertically here. Button then bets 33% of the pot. That's what this B33 stands for. And big blind folds. What an eventful hand to start grade 1 of the Carrot Poker skill, huh guys? But don't worry, there's a lot we can actually glean from this situation. So in this example, big blind is called pre, checked the flop, and then folded to button's small bet. Button's hand in this exact situation was actually 10-9 of diamonds. This really happened at some point in the universe, in some realm, I don't know. Probably this hand has occurred, right? So button's hand was 10-9 of diamonds, and big blind's hand was the ace-deuce of spades. This means that on the flop, button's equity with 10 high was only 29%, and big blind's was 71%. So big blind's hand, equity-wise, was entitled to beat button's hand 29% of the time, but that doesn't actually matter here because big blind doesn't live in a world where he has x-ray vision and can see button's cards, hopefully for button. So equity doesn't tell us who's going to win the pot. It's very common in poker that you have to call with the worst hand or fold with the best one because you don't know what your opponent has. It sounds really basic. But the point here is that the equity of ace-deuce actually has very little to do with the EV of the hand, because although the hand has a whopping 71% equity against this hand, and has quite a lot of equity actually against button's range, I would estimate it has a fair chunk, like it's probably a dog to button's range, but it'll be in the 40s, I would think, comfortably. At least high 30s. So against this hand, it's crushing and it has to fold. Against range, it's got way more equity than you would think it would need mathematically to call. But the problem is that because the EV of this hand is so low, because it's going to struggle so much to continue on the turn, a lot of its equity actually resides in the times when ace high is just good at showdown and button lets us get there. Since button won't let us get there all the time, and in fact we'll be betting the flop fairly frequently here, probably 70% of the time in theory, depending on your range inputs, then barreling the average turn card 40, 45, 50% of the time. You can just see that there's a lot of times where we just cannot profitably call, as game theory prohibits us from making an investment that's minus EV. We don't get to realize our equity. Note that if we tried to realize our equity by calling flop and turn or something like that, or even just calling flop, we'd be cutting off our nose to spite our face. Our EV would be even worse because the additional money that we'd be losing by making that investment would matter. Remember, equity doesn't think about that additional money that we lose by calling flop here. So this is just a very crude example to prove that equity, in its inability to consider the lack of EV through fold equity, is extremely incomplete. But that's not the only reason for which this concept equity is an incomplete notion. So more about unrealizable equity now. So let's say that we are big blind against under the gun. We check in a single raise pot and under the gun bets 33% of the pot. It's back to us and we have the choice of what to do with queen 10 of hearts. Have a think about this, pause the video. What would you do with this hand? Okay, I'll assume that you've got some thoughts together. Well, how often did you think theory suggests under the gun should bet this flop? First of all, what do you think? High frequency, low frequency, all the time, never? That's right. Under the gun should always bet this flop in GTO terms because it's an extremely advantageous spot for his range. We'll talk about this in a future lecture, how a range advantage can cause you to want to bet the flop really frequently. Again, a range is a collection of hands, so when lots of your hands are doing well, there are more reasons for your range to want to bet at high frequency, and there might even be a loss of EV if you don't bet everything here. Be lots of hands that lose EV by checking, but no hands that lose EV by betting in under the gun's range. So that's why this happens, but more on that later. What did you think Big Blind did in response? So this hand might have looked tempting to you. After all, it has backdoor straight draws. Sometimes we can hit this queen or 10 and have the best hand. We have the backdoor flush draw, the hearts, of course. The issue with this hand is that, well, one, we're out of position, which means that our opponent has absolute control over whether bets go in over the next few streets and we don't. Secondly, he has a tight under the gun range, which is extremely powerful on this board and will just naturally be betting at high frequency later on and retaining a lot of equity against us, even if we're lucky enough to hit a queen or a 10 on the turn. So given that our so-called pair draws, this is an expression you'll hear me use a lot throughout the school, pair draws. Given that they are fairly lousy against such a tight range, the solver folds 100% of the time here. When this frequency gets to 100%, the implication is that calling would be worse than folding. That's why it's never being taken. If calling was okay, it would probably be being chosen at a certain frequency, though what we're looking at here is a frequency view and not an EV view. But we can certainly infer that the EV of calling this hand or raising it is negative against under the gun c-bet, even though the under the gun player is betting 100% of range. It's not to say that this hand would always be negative against every player. If the EV swing of call here is not that negative, it's possible that opponents who under aggress on the next street might give us enough equity or realizable equity, give us enough EV that is, to call this bet. But let's frame this in the context of EV compared with equity. Big Blind's equity against under the gun's range is 22%. That's how well queen 10 with the backdoor is doing. Not actually very well, right? But if we were just looking at equity, this would be enough to call a 1/3 pot size bet because we only need 20% win frequency here, but the win frequency is actually 0 because we always have to fold. And if we called, our EV would be worse than getting back none of this pot. Our EV, that's to say, would be negative. So we can say that all of Big Blind's 22% equity in this situation is unrealizable. Not one shred of it is actually worth anything. Unless, of course, our opponent makes a mistake and checks this flop, illustrating the importance to actually range bet this situation when the Big Blind has so many weak hands that just have to fold. Denying equity is a big reason for this bet. It's not the only one, of course, and it's not the primary one. But under the gun will be incentivized to bet with all of his hands. He'll always be betting here, and Big Blind will always fold when he has queen 10 of hearts. That's just the way it goes when Big Blind has this hand. Therefore, when Big Blind has queen 10 of hearts, under the gun's EV is 100% of the pot, and Big Blind's EV is 0. Of course, we have other hands in our range here that are much higher EV. We do continue to this bet sometimes, but overall we do a lot of folding because we have a lot of hands like this. And even some of our best air hands, like the queen 10 with multiple backdoors, are not good enough to continue in this very hostile EV environment where we're out of position against such a strong range. When is equity everything? So far we've been kind of berating this concept and saying that it's no good, it doesn't describe the game tree accurately enough, it only presides over hypothetical scenarios. But the closer we get to a so-called end of action spot, the more relevant our equity becomes to our decision. Well, what is an end of action spot? An end of action spot occurs when we are considering either calling or folding to what will certainly be the last bet of the hand. This occurs when someone goes all in and there are no other players in the pot. There can be no action after we call, but more commonly, end of action spots happen on the river, which is of course the last street where any action can happen. Provided that raise is not going to be our choice, we know that whatever we do between call or fold, that action will constitute the last one of the hand. At that point, all of our equity against our opponent's range becomes completely realizable, and we don't have to worry about fluctuations between EV and equity. They will be one and the same thing. That allows us to use equity mathematically and think about our equity as the sole source of our EV. But of course, working that equity out or trying to estimate it is a difficult process that still involves many factors. Let's talk a bit about indifference points. Our hand is indifferent between calling and folding, i.e. has the same EV for each action, if and only if our equity is equal to the following: to our investment divided by the final pot after we have called. A useful formula for this kind of situation is this one. The end of action spot equity required is equal to our call, the value of our call, divided by the final pot after the call. In other words, the final pot after the call becomes part of it. What we're really doing here in essence is asking, how much of that new pot after I've called do I need to get back in order to recoup no more and no less than my call investment? That's the same question as, what percentage of that new final pot does my call constitute? People get confused here and often end up forgetting that the call becomes part of the pot at the point where it goes in, and so to get the call back, it needs to be seen as a percentage of the new pot or final pot that we're trying to recoup. Earlier on in the hand, we can refer to spots where we're facing bets as open action spots. These are the opposite of end of action. In these situations, it doesn't work to perform such a calculation as end of action required equity equaling call divided by call after final pot. It doesn't actually make sense because there are too many other polluting factors in play that are going to distort the picture. So in such spots, we might well need to fold a hand with more equity than our equation requires, or we might call a hand with less. And that's because there's a very large disconnect early on in a hand in an open action spot between EV and equity. And of course, it's not actually equity that we care about, it's EV. It just so happens that in end of action spots, EV and equity become really one and the same thing. Maybe not currency-wise, not numerically, but there is no other factor that leads to EV being what it is other than having enough equity and the pot odds, the amount you actually have to pay. So things that will differentiate EV from equity before we reach one of these end of action spots will be concepts like implied odds. A hand having the ability to harvest additional money from an opponent's stack is going to be something that greatly increases the EV of that hand above and beyond the pot share it has in equity. Position, as we've seen already, being in position gives you control over future action, future pot growth. You're more likely to be able to value bet multiple times or have the opportunity to bluff when you're in position because there's less procedurally checking to the opponent because your range is too weak, as happens out of position. In other words, when you're in position, your opponent has to check to you first, thus weakening their range and allowing you to build a betting range that you might not have the luxury of building when out of position yourself. Realizability, as we've seen, you're less likely to face as much aggression when you're in position. Your opponent has less control over that in different action sequences. And not only that, but your hand will be able to call more bets because it will have higher EV on the next street. This increases realizability and therefore increases EV above and beyond what equity might be on average or might be out of position. Relative skill is another factor. It's easy to exaggerate the importance of this factor, but when you have a skill advantage on an opponent, not only are you going to be able to just capitalize passively on the mistakes that they make, but you may also have an active read or game plan which is designed to specifically target a weakness in their game, basically pushing your EV through the roof. For example, if I know that an opponent is a big calling station, I can make a pre-flop investment I might not normally make, such as opening 7-8 offsuit on the button. Not a horrible open, but probably a losing one in game theory. Knowing that my opponent will make massive mistakes whenever I have a good hand, I can then revert to a strategy of being extremely aggressive for value, under bluffing, and pillaging my opponent for even more EV. So when does equity not equal EV? What are the situations where we need to be super careful about even thinking about equity in the first place? Well, one is a situation like this. Here we have a single raise pot, small blind versus big blind. Small blind opens, big blind calls pre-flop. And on a board like ace queen 8, which should strike you as very favourable for the out of position player here, for the pre-flop raiser, small blind's range equity is 57%. That means the equity of his entire range against his opponent's entire range in game theory is 57%. If you're wondering where am I getting these numbers from, they come from solves, simulations. The solver is basically telling me what the equity would be in a GTO world. This is a very good baseline for reality, although of course in reality things may be slightly different. Small blind's range EV, however, is considerably lower, coming in at only 53%, and the problem here is that being out of position just doesn't allow the small blind to control pot growth as easily, doesn't allow him to progress through the hand as frequently, and lowers the EV of calling or making future bets, forcing him to give up on hands more often. So here's a question. Why is small blind's EV expressed as a percentage of the pot lower than his or her equity? And the answer is, of course, positional advantage or disadvantage is completely ignored by equity, but described fully by EV. That's why these are not the same number. Here's a pie chart that demonstrates how often, when someone wins at showdown, it's hero compared with villain. Let's say that hero is in the small blind here, villain in the big blind. So the times that someone wins at showdown, it's usually hero. That doesn't mean that hero has this much equity. The equity is not that high, it's only 57, not 73 or whatever this is. But the thing is that big blind will be folding a lot more than small blind will before the river. Moreover, big blind will have to show down some really low showdown value hands, having a range disadvantage, whereas small blind will be able to bluff profitably, having a range advantage with his own low showdown value hands. Therefore, the times that one of these players actually wins by going to showdown and flipping their cards over, most of those times it's small blind who's winning, because he's the guy that doesn't have to fold all the time and gets to bluff very freely when he has a bad hand. These luxuries don't apply to big blind, who has to fold a lot and has to be more selective about what they bluff. However, when we zoom out here and take a bird's eye view of the full story as to who wins this pot, on average, usually it's neither player at showdown, but someone wins by someone else folding. And again, the guy with the range advantage, which is small blind, is going to fold less often than the player with a disadvantage, who's big blind, and therefore most of the fold equity will come from big blind. However, the showdown value of a hand, or equity of a hand, is not so important given that usually somebody folds. So on the flop here, while equity is still a driving factor and it has a lot to do with what you should do and how you should play and what your range is doing, it's not going to be realized very frequently. So this hypothetical amount of the time where equity actually describes who wins is actually way less than half of the game tree. I got this data by actually exploring GTO sims and looking at fold frequencies versus showdown frequencies across all branches in the tree to actually ascertain how often a hand goes to showdown. This is not just made up. Let's turn our attention now to end of action spots specifically, and we'll return to this hand where big blind actually folded on the 8-3 flop. However, this time we're going to replace his cards with king queen. So big blind check calls the flop this time. King queen high is a very strong pair draw. It's two really big cards. It has immediate showdown value. Admittedly, this hand will not realize all of its equity. The lack of position will not help in that respect. And of course, when we miss the turn, we'll often have to fold king high and fold the best hand. However, this hand has some redeeming factors. It has quite a lot of implied odds the times it hits a king or a queen, because this will be a very strong hand and will on average allow the big blind to value bet the river very big when turn goes check check, or call down profitably against most bet sizes that button could use. And so this hand does have to call a 33% pot size bet. In other words, we need 20% EV. Pot share expressed as EV needs to be 20% to make this flop call, and king queen is comfortably exceeding that target. Its equity will be even higher than its EV here, but of course it's the EV that we care about at this early juncture in the hand. On the queen of spades turn, in a wide range configuration, we hit a very strong hand here. We face a 75% pot size bet, and we have a very clear call. While this hand is very high equity, it's not quite high enough against a large sizing to start raising on this node, though I don't think raise is totally ridiculous, given that it is big blind button and not big blind under the gun or something like that. But call is the standard play here, and button ends up B150ing the river, meaning betting 1.5x the pot. The button will be making this large river bet mainly, well, exclusively actually, with value hands that beat king-queen and bluffs which king-queen beats. What this means is that our hand against this action sequence is actually now just a bluff catcher, and its equity will come down to how often villain is bluffing when we hold these cards. Big blind should therefore not really care about the absolute strength of his hand in terms of hand ranking, but focus more on the blocker properties and what they do to our equity. We'll talk more about common blocker effects in Lecture 10, but for now suffice to say that this hand has relatively positive blockers, and Big Blind is going to need relatively positive blockers to call such a large bet. Most of his range is supposed to fold at this juncture. So to call the 150% pot river bet, this hand is going to need, using our equation for end of action spots, 150, that's the call back, divided by the 100 that villain is betting into, the 150 chips that villain has risked, and our call at the end of the day that becomes part of the pot. So we get to factor that in as the total pot from which we're trying to recoup our investment. This means that we require 37.5% equity to call, and versus a G2 opponent, according to PileSolver, this hand has basically about that. So this hand's strength, its EV, its equity have fluctuated wildly throughout the course of this hand. On the flop, the hand was doing comfortably better than it had to make an investment, and made a relatively profitable investment. Its EV was pretty high. On the turn, its EV was very high, and it was absolutely printing tons of money with this turn call here. But on this branch of the tree, where our opponent bets massive, unfortunately facing this bet, and don't worry, we won't always face this bet, guys, it's not that bad. But when we do face this bet, our hand gets reduced to merely being a bluff catcher, a hand that will be winning whenever villain is bluffing and losing otherwise. We can probably still call here, ignore the exact percentage we're winning, but it'll be close enough that we can end up calling, and I think it's a very break-even investment to make. It doesn't really matter whether we call river or not. So it's only actually our equity that's relevant by the river, but on the turn, for example, our EV was higher than our equity because our pair was so good it entitled us to a lot of implied odds. Okay, not when our opponent takes this really aggressive river line, but at that point in the tree we didn't know that was going to happen. Lots of other things were going to happen very frequently. This is a rare occurrence, right? So by the time we get to the river, all of those other factors like implied odds, position, both positive and negative ones, realizability, none of them matter anymore, and we're simply reduced to a mathematical concept where we have to figure out if our equity is likely to be sufficient to call this bet or not. The way to figure this out is to focus on blockers. This is for a future lesson, but suffice to say for now that we're not trying to calculate our equity here. We're calculating our equity target and then asking if we have that much equity. Rather than saying how high can I jump, we're actually saying how high is that fence, measuring it, and then trying to jump over it. It would be very hard to measure how high you could jump. It'd be much easier just to gauge whether it was enough to clear a certain wall or fence, if you'll entertain the analogy there for a second. So let's move on now to this idea that EV can be viewed as a tree. It's possible to imagine a hand of poker like a tree, which starts off with a thick trunk where lots of the branches are still possible, and then branches off to thicker branches, thinner branches, twigs, stems, shoots, leaves, and eventually nothing out with that, where leaves are falling off of the tree. This is how a tree works, and in poker it's the same thing, where by the time that you're at the end of a hand, you're on twig at the end of a branch, but there were many other branches and twigs and leaves that you could have ended up on. That's why it's so important not just to be like, well, why did we call the turn if we're going to face the B150 on the river in that last hand? Well, the reason is that that's just a very unlikely twig at the end of an unlikely branch. So we're searching for the highest EV play. This is what we're doing, as we saw at the start. We're not just trying to do something profitable, we're trying to do the most profitable thing. And we might not have the processing power, we're not solvers, we don't have perfect information either, so we're not really able to think about every single branch on the tree. So instead, as humans, it definitely behooves us to prioritize the branches that have the greatest frequency and magnitude. That's to say, if something happens really often, we care about it, and if something is extremely valuable or extremely harmful, we also tend to care about it. Big blind versus button, another common spot. Big blind checks the flop, button has the chance to decide what to do with queen 9. Pause the video, what would you do? Would you bet here? Would you check here? Do you think it matters? If so, how much does it matter? Okay, I'll assume that you've had a go at that. According to PileSolver, who's a pretty reliable source for telling us how things are objectively in the theory of the game, though of course the solver can't account for deficiencies in our opponent's strategy and how we should adapt to them, But in the objective realm, this hand is a mix. 57% of the time the solver chooses to bet, 43% of the time it chooses to check. That doesn't entail that betting is better than checking. It just entails that that's the right frequency of betting to make us unexploitable overall when we insert this hand into the overall range grid and think about the long-term battle. As humans, we might deviate from this, like I say, but this gives us a very good baseline for what we should be doing. It's not that we should be betting this hand 57% or 42% of the time or anything like that. We're not trying to memorize frequencies. It's just that we should be relatively indifferent between betting and checking here, and that should be our default disposition with this hand. We shouldn't arrive on the flop with a skewed bias towards either betting or checking that's not got strong exploitative justification, because if we do that, we're basically seeing the game tree in a really skewed way where we're favoring one action for no reason. The idea here is that Pile Solver is teaching us to adopt a position of neutrality between betting and checking in this situation. So the solver is indifferent here, but that doesn't mean that the situation is simple. Just because these two lines have the same EV doesn't mean that there isn't a complex and intricate journey that the solver goes on to explore that phenomenon of equality between actions. There are pros and cons to both the option of betting 33% pot and the option of checking. For example, when we bet, our brain might attach itself right away to the branches of the tree where we get to build the pot versus many worse made hands and draws. Do you ever find yourself imagining that your opponent has a 7, pocket 8s, pocket 6s, 5x, ace jack of diamonds, or perhaps 6-8 suited, and then wanting to bet because of those hands? That's a natural inclination, but if you stop there, of course, you're only focusing on one area of the tree at a time. That's a very crooked outlook. You might also note the benefit of denying equity to live ace-x or king-x hands which could fold. This is especially prominent in a human's thought process because we're creatures who are trained to remember the times we get hurt. This is how our survival mechanisms function, and we're extremely survival-oriented creatures. For example, if you check here and the turn is a king, and villain ends up rolling over king 6 and value bets twice against you and you pay off, you might well feel negatively towards your flop check. You might even just bet the flop the next time, maybe subconsciously, maybe consciously, because you're trying to prevent that eventuality from recurring because it hurt to some extent. Not saying it's ruining your day entirely, but it's going to cause enough of a sting to be memorable. So these two small parts of the tree, these are not in any way near the full game tree, but they're extremely prominent because the idea of getting value for your hand and being paid off and getting what your hand is worth is extremely attractive. Earning money, we're very motivated by the gaining of resources through having a right to gain those resources. Legitimate gaining of resources, that does a lot for a human, as does protecting the resources we already have, which is why we always focus on denying equity to live hands, even though it's not a big part of the game tree, right? How often does villain actually have an ace? And if he does have an ace, how many times will he outdraw you? You're talking about splitting the game tree, not just in two, but exponentially splitting it into lots of little bits there, just for you to get hurt by ace-x. There are also disadvantages to betting that usually go unnoticed by humans. For example, when we get folds from very low EV hands like Jack of Hearts, 9 of Hearts, a hand that's only got 3 outs, and is going to be bluffing later at some frequency, or maybe even hitting a pair of 9s which we dominate, or a pair of jacks which we dominate, sorry, this hand has no outs, we have a pair of queens, then we're very happy for that hand to remain in the pot, right? This hand is drawing dead. So it's not that we want it in the pot just for the sake of it, but the idea is that there's two avenues upon which we could earn more money from this hand later, because we certainly won't earn anything by betting flop, right? Not theoretically at least. So later on in the hand, villain could easily bluff here or hit an inferior hand and then pay us off in some way, shape or form. Fourthly, we would not like the idea of building the bigger pot when villain has queen 10 plus. If you could see villain's cards, this is a useful thought experiment actually. Imagine you can see his cards and he's got king queen, or he's got a set, or he's got 2 pair. You would check, wouldn't you? So in this case, there are two negatives of betting that very often go unnoticed that absolutely balance out the positives of betting. Check is a line that doesn't even really get analysed very often. When I hear people analyse this spot and they're amateur poker players, they're very likely to say something like, I want to bet for value here. I'm going to target 7x. I'm going to get called by worse hands. I'm going to protect my equity against gut shots. Something like this. What I don't hear people say is a full analysis of checking. So there are disadvantages to checking as well, but there are also pros to this line. Firstly, checking leaves the pot smaller versus worse hands and draws. It gives ace-x and king-x hands some realization of equity that they would not get if we were to bet, and these are definitely disadvantages, right? I want to earn as much money as possible against a pair of fives or a pair of sevens or a queen six, and I don't want villain to outdraw me with a king. So again, when we only focus on these branches of the tree and have this lopsided, biased analysis, we end up wanting to bet. However, there are benefits to checking just as there are weaknesses to betting. Checking on the one hand allows villain to bluff later with bad hands, like the Jack 9 of hearts for example. We want to leave that hand in the pot here, not just for the sake of it, but so it can invest later because it won't invest if we bet. And lastly, we get to keep the pot a bit smaller and probably lose less money on average than we would by betting flop if villain has a set queen jack, queen 7, something like that. So try to remember, overall, poker, a hand of poker, the full game of poker, they're trees that branch off as we move further and further into a hand. When we only consider one of our choices or only consider some of the pros of a choice without looking at the cons, we can get deluded. Most people c-bet this hand more than the solver does, and the reason that the average c-bet frequency for this hand is higher is that there are many humans who always c-bet this hand, but very few who always check it. And that's due to a biased analysis, where people prioritize these first 2 points and ignore the rest. Try to see the full game tree. It will really help you grow as a player if you can do this sooner rather than later in your poker career. So let's look at the EV tree now on the turn. And in particular, we'll study a turn betting opportunity. So let's say that we decided to bet the flop and get called in this situation. This time we decided to bet, not because we think it's better, but because we're going to do it sometimes. And maybe we rolled a bet on our random number generator, or we just decided to do it this time, it's not too important, with our queen 9. On the turn, this hand is played now as a pure check by the solver. And again, this doesn't mean that in every world you will always have to check this hand. You might come up with an exploitative reason to bet. You might say, I don't think the real world is like the solver world in this respect or that respect, and therefore I want to deviate from the solver's advice. But if you don't have a strong reason to think that the landscape you're in differs from the one the solver is in, then you should actually check this hand on the turn. It's slightly better. The numbers you see here on the right hand side of this hand, this extract from Pio Solver, are EVs. So in other words, the solver is saying that you get 79.92% of the pot by betting small, 81.48% of the pot by betting bigger, less by overbetting because it's a misplay of the hand, it's a polarization mistake. You're basically trying to value bet a hand that's not good enough for that sizing. And then check is the highest EV, coming in at 81.79% of the pot. This is not your real life EV. This is your theoretical EV, but it's the best benchmark you have for measuring, unless you have exploitative considerations going on. So why is this the case? Well, although technically we can bet and be a favourite when called, that does fulfill the definition of our bet being labelled a value bet if we make it, this hand is not that far ahead after it bets and gets called. So a lot of this, the equity this hand has, which is probably in the 70s, it's a strong hand, is really, really good. Even after we bet, it's going to be in the, the equity will be still a favourite above 50%, but it's not going to be enough of a favourite that the pros of betting outweigh the cons. The pros of checking are saving money when behind and making bets from villains' river bluffs. And these, according to the solver, slightly grant this hand a higher check EV than bet EV. Despite the cons of checking, these are still apparent, of not denying any further equity, and of course making a bit less from hands that if we knew villain had, we would bet 3 times, right? If I knew you had queen 8, I would never check. If I knew you had 7x, I would never check. And this is the problem with when people say, I'm targeting this hand. You're basically only thinking about the branch on the tree where he has those hands. That's not a conclusive thought process. It's really problematic. So we have this thing called the tunnel vision pitfall. And this is basically something that deserves to be mentioned right at the start of this course because it sinks the EV of many an aspiring player's thought process. And it works as follows. I've just written down here the flop, the turn, and our hand, just to remind you guys of the spot that we're looking at currently. So it's very easy. This is the idea. It's very easy to focus on only one part of the EV tree and reach a very biased conclusion as to what we should do. Try to fix this leak as early on in your career as you possibly can. It's the sort of thing where if you do something that's not so great over and over again, it becomes a habit for us humans, doesn't it? And we end up doing it again and again. How many unhelpful thought patterns do you have in life that you've got into the swing of operating under throughout your lives that you just wish you could sort of eradicate, but you can't because they're so ingrained? The same thing happens in poker. It's actually much easier for me as a poker coach to teach someone that's barely played any poker than someone that's played for 20 years and done everything wrong. I hope this course will help you though if you have played for 20 years and done everything wrong. I hope it will sort of help you reset. So here are some examples of the tunnel vision leaks in action in this spot. So remember, on the turn here, we have the chance to double barrel. Should we do it? Should we not do it? Here's an example of how we might get this spot wrong, because the spot is supposed to be a check. So what do you think is missing from the following thought processes then? I bet to get protection from flush draws. I bet to get value from pocket pairs. I bet because I had top pair. I didn't want to face a river bet and be in a tough spot. Have a think about these individually, pause the video, and then I'll assume you've done that and I'll go through what I think is wrong with them. Okay, let's get into the answers. I bet to get protection from flush draws is highly illogical in lots of different ways. It's one of the most flawed things that you could ever say in this spot. Firstly, a flush draw is not folding to a bet here, so if the diamond is destined to be coming on the river, you actually want to check your hand, since your opponent isn't folding to a normal bet size anyway. The other problem with this is that flush draws are a very small part of your opponent's range. While they exist, they sometimes exist with a pair or a queen, sometimes just ace high, king high, that floated the flop, maybe a straight draw with a flush draw. These hands, in addition to not folding, are also just not enough of villain's range for you to worry about. You can worry about them to an extent, but they don't deserve the full center stage of your thought process. You have to tunnel in on them in order to make them seem more important than they actually are. Because we're visually processing creatures, we tend to look at this board texture and see two diamonds. The two blue cards has a stronger effect than it deserves to because of the way that our senses process the world. They prioritize vision. I bet to get value from pocket pairs. Okay, this is part of the game tree. It's probably a bigger part of the game tree than villain having a flush draw, so you could argue that it's a slight improvement. It's still a very bad thought process because it focuses in on one type of hand only. Anything that ignores large parts of the game tree for no reason is not a reliable thought process. It's deluding you. I bet because I had top pair. I'm not even really sure what this means. Rigid designators for your hand, such as top pair, flush straight, two pair, ace high, they're not very useful because they don't describe your relative hand strength, and we'll talk about this in a future lecture. Rather, they describe absolute hand strength as if it's the same on every board in every positional configuration, in every action sequence. How good top pair is depends on the kicker, the line, the positions, the villain, everything. And even in theory, it depends on many factors. Of course, villain doesn't come into it in theory. And finally, I didn't want to face a river bet and be in a tough spot. This is basically a very natural human tendency to want to avoid future emotions that we don't like. For example, if a situation is very likely to make me angry, there's an instinct to remove myself from that situation before I become full of rage. If I am considering doing something that I know I'll feel guilty about later, part of my reluctance to perform that action is wanting to avoid the imminent guilt that hangs over me if I take that action. We are motivated both in and outside of poker to avoid future unpleasantness, but that's not the same thing as maximizing EV. So sometimes we actually take an action so that we get to feel better in the next 5 or 10 seconds and avoid something that causes us stress, but that's a misfiring of our human inclination to avoid stress. What we should actually be doing in poker is embracing any emotion that's likely to be coming next and dealing with it, processing it, acting correctly in spite of it. So if facing river bets makes you feel like you're in a tough spot, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's really bad EV-wise to allow your opponent to bet the river. It's absolutely not. In fact, it's great with this hand when he bets the river. You have an extremely profitable call on most runouts against most bet sizes. So a better way to think here would be, okay, let me weigh up all of the pros and cons of betting and checking. Not all of them, but the most significant ones, again, in terms of magnitude and frequency, and try to solve the spot from there. How do we do that? Well, studying with solvers, getting a feel for how we should play certain parts of our range objectively is really what it's all about. It's rinse and repeat, repetition, right? That's how we learn. So what's missing is an analysis of checking from all of these thought processes. Okay, this one talks about an emotion that might follow if we check. It doesn't actually analyze the EV of checking. There's no analysis of the EV cons of betting, nor is there really any consideration to most or all of villain's range in any of these thought processes. They're all tunnel vision. It's very important to view choices as comparisons of EV. The following situation is what we call a double delayed c-bet opportunity. What this means is that the button player has had the chance to bet the flop, but has elected not to, has had the chance to bet the turn, but again has chosen to check, and now has the chance to bet the river. In this situation, the pot is 100 chips. How we got to 100 chips doesn't really matter. I've just chosen this because it's a nice round number. Button's hand here is King Jack. This hand has 34% equity on the river. Now that you know that, go ahead and plan out how you would play this hand. Would you bet and would you check? Write down why. Okay, I'll assume you've had to think about that. You've written something down. What if I told you that villain folds 57% of the time to a bet that's 75% of the pot? Does this cause you to change your mind, or are you going to stick with your answer? Well, choices are comparisons, so let's weigh this one up. First off, the EV of checking. How do we figure this out? Using the theoretical data that the solver tells us is correct here. Again, in reality, things may be slightly different. We know that when we check here with a 34% equity, we're going to win the pot 34% of the time. When this happens, when we win the pot, we win plus 100 chips. We will lose the other 66% of the time, and our EV on that branch of the tree will be 0. In order to figure out the overall EV of checking, all we have to do is multiply the magnitude of each branch by its frequency, and that will get us the expectation. The branch where we win happens 34% of the time, and we get 100 chips. Therefore, we win 34 chips there. The branch where we lose, we get 0 chips, and we don't lose anything either, bear in mind, because we haven't bet, and that happens 2/3 of the time. Therefore, our net EV for checking is plus 34 chips. Now betting 75% pot. We know from the equilibrium that villain calls or raises every time that he doesn't fold, which is 43% of the time. We know that the EV, when this happens, when we get called or raised with King Jack, is going to be minus 75 from the point of view of just before we bet. Again, very important to compare both of these lines from the same point in the hand, meaning that we lose 75 chips every time this happens, 75% of 100. The other branch is where villain folds. This will happen 57% of the time, and just as in the branch where we check and win, we bet. Our EV is plus 100. We can't count getting our bet back out of the pot. In this case, it's a profit because it's not, so our EV is plus 100 chips. Again, we take the frequency and magnitude of each branch, multiply them together, and this time our EV is lower. It's 24.75 chips. Consider this though. Betting is plus EV. Betting is a dreadful error. Contradiction? Hopefully by now you're realizing that there is in fact no contradiction at all here. Any implied hypocrisy with this claim is absolutely imaginary. There's nothing wrong with me saying that betting is really profitable, but it's also a dreadful error. It would be really profitable for you to be given $100, but if you turn down $200 in order to take that $100, it would be a dreadful error. Checking is better. It's very important that we see choices between bet and check as EV comparisons, and that we investigate both sides. As a disclaimer, no, we're not going to be doing this in real time. We're not going to be performing math like this. We won't know these values here for a start, and we won't want to calculate them in 10 seconds. But what we can do is learn the pattern that hands with this much showdown value return far too great of a check EV for them to be good as bluffs. While it's profitable to bluff here with this hand, that's what it would be. It's a very big error because check is so good. Okay, let's move on. One final thing to go over before we summarize today's lecture and move on to the homework task. In this next spot, being out of position, remember we've talked about position already, but we're going to enforce this point a bit more now, will make the EV of checking worse than that of betting. So much for being the spokesperson for checking and defending it. I'm now going to show you a spot where actually checking is something you're not allowed to do, theoretically speaking. Here we have blind versus blind on Ace Jack 5 two-tone, meaning there's a flush draw present on the flop. Small blind bets small and big blind calls, and small blind has a c-bet opportunity on the turn. We call this a turn c-bet spot. Small blind's hand is 8-7 of hearts, meaning he has 8 high, but an open-end straight draw. There are very few hands in theory here that are mandatory turn bluffs. Most turn bluffs in most spots, especially in position, are merely optional. You can make them or you can wait. Sometimes that might be because bluffing is just not worth much and you can just show the hand down because it's not great to bluff. There's not a lot of fold equity. Other spots, it may be that you can bluff turn or river. As long as you bluff by the end of the hand, it's fine. In this spot though, it's more about urgency. It's about the immediacy of betting now. So when a hand has no showdown value, but it does have nut potential, like it does have reasons to want to invest money, and we're out of position, we might actually struggle to realize equity by checking. Imagine you check and you face a bet here. You probably have to raise, right? That's a very expensive way to bluff. You can't really call a bet here. I don't think you can fold either. So probably you have to raise, and that'll be plus EV to check raise. But it won't, with a weak hand like this, be as plus EV as just betting immediately. So it can actually be an error to fail to bluff in such situations. So much for position lowering your EV. It does, but that doesn't always mean that you play more passively. Sometimes when check gets made worse, because betting and checking are a comparison, remember, you actually have to bet Not because betting is amazing, being out of position betting will never be that great here, it'll be okay, but because checking is even worse. So look out for this combination of factors, where you have a very frail, flimsy hand with some nut potential, and you can't really check. Okay, EVs here, 33 chips to 32 chips, not a big deal, 33% pot I should say, to 32. It's not by much, but you can see the point, right? The main concept to illustrate here is that this hand is betting all of the time in theory because checking does incur some theoretical EV loss. Let's summarize everything that we've learned today. It's been quite a meaty lecture. I hope that you found it useful, and it's been a gentle immersion into the Carrot Poker School way of doing things. But it's very good that we summarize as we go because this course is dense. If you're doing a full scholarship, you're in for quite a marathon, so it's good to go over things every step of the way and make sure that we don't forget anything. It can easily be a case of temporary learning in poker because there's so much to take in, right? Let's avoid that. So firstly, equity describes our hypothetical pot share if the hand was to go to showdown. Okay, great. That's all it's doing. It's not telling us how often we'll win. It's not telling us how much we'll win. It's just telling us what we would win if we went to showdown. A very useful concept, but far from everything. EV describes our average monetary gain or loss based on all of the factors present in a hand of poker. Implied odds, position, fold equity, realizability, all of these things. All encompassed in EV. That's why EV is the holy grail. Equity is a large part of EV, but far from all of it. Just because we're saying equity isn't all it could be, just because we're saying it's not as powerful as EV, doesn't mean that it's not still an extremely important factor. It absolutely is. It's the core mechanic of why you do what you do. But equity does not describe things like future bets earned, future folds, nor the impact of position. And because EV does describe all of these things, that's why EV is often higher or lower than equity, especially in open action spots. A hand of poker should be seen like a tree of possibilities. There will be positive and negative branches, which together amount to our EV in the hand. A hand can be entitled to less or more of the pot in EV than it has in equity. And we want to avoid this tunnel vision pitfall, which is a very common problem at grade 1 level, where players focus too much and too narrowly on only one part of the tree, and in the process they're often only examining betting and ignoring checking. Sometimes the question is, do I want to bet? And the way they answer that is by looking at betting. But if I offered you £100 and £200, part of accepting the 200 would be to see that it's higher than the 100 and rejecting that offer. And finally, checking is usually worse out of position with frail draws than in position, and so you sometimes have to bluff these hands when out of position on the turn, not because betting is amazing, but because checking is not that great out of position. And this is very much due to realizability and the fact that you probably have to raise and not call if you face a bet in some of these spots. So a lot to take in today, a lot of different things to think about here. I'll give you another chance to practice this now. This is your homework exercise for this lecture. You're going to look at the thought processes listed here on the right and score them out of 10. How well do these thought processes compare the EV of betting to that of checking? And therefore, how good a job do they do? I want you to come back to the end of this video when you've gone over this exercise on your own and written down some answers. And then I would like you to unpause and look at the feedback for this homework task, which we're going to do right now. Okay, let me give you guys the feedback for this homework task. So first off, we should bet to stop flush draws getting there. This is a very problematic thing to say, partially because flush draws are not going away when we bet, they're actually going to raise us or they're going to call us, and neither of those things is particularly amazing. Okay, getting called is fine, but getting raised, that could spell the end of the hand for our threes, right? They're not going away, so we can't stop them from getting there, and they don't really encompass that much of villain's range. Secondly, we should bet to deny equity to overcards like King Jack and Queen Jack. Again, a bit tunnel visiony. We're not really thinking about the full game tree when we say that. And how much equity do those hands have? They generally have 6 outs. That's about, okay, and they can also win with a 5 or a 4 here, which negates our 3. So they probably have more equity than normal here, but still not enough that we want to use that as a sufficient and sole reason for betting. It's not as bad a thought process as the first one, but it's still too specific. We should bet for value because ace-x can call us. This is horrible. Maybe you can bet for value here, but ace-x is not necessarily enough combos on its own to mean that your favorite when called. So you need to explore all of villain's calling range, the hands that beat you and the hands that you beat, to see what your equity scores against it. Number 4, betting for value is quite thin, as villain can call better hands in R3s as well as the worst ones. This is definitely true. There are a lot of better hands that continue to a bet here that are still in villain's range, and we need to factor these into our EV. when we bet. This is definitely the best thought process so far. Number 5, we should bet because he showed weakness. I would score this one incredibly low. This one doesn't even mean anything. Just because your equity is reasonable doesn't mean it's enough to value bet. Your threshold for value betting this hand on the turn will be more than just being a slight favourite. So just because you're ahead a lot of the time, you can't infer from that you should value bet. And him showing weakness, I guess this is like a bit of a dangerous way to word that. I'd rather say his range is quite capped rather than he showed weakness. I think showed weakness is going into a bit too specific and exploitative sort of domain where we're almost getting a bit too human about it. I think we can be more objective. Number 6, we should bet so that villain can't bluff us on the river. Again, this is like the one we talked about earlier. We're trying to avoid decisions that make us uncomfortable. If you get bluffed on the river, the thing is that by calling a river bet on a lot of cards, you will actually have positive EV with this hand, or at least like 0 EV. So you can probably call the river on a lot of spots if you want to. But that's not really important because there are many times when villain value bets the river and you fold, and that's a good thing. You're ignoring those with that statement. And you're also just ignoring the times he checks the river and you get to thin value bet or check back and win a lot. So just because you don't like one of the branches on the tree doesn't mean that the whole tree isn't still good for you when you check. It's still fine. Checking is quite high EV here because we win so often at showdown. This is definitely true. The EV of check is a lot of the pot here. You have a big pot entitlement by checking, and that's mostly down to your equity, but also you're in position. You're going to realize all of your equity here and thus never miss the opportunity to river a boat or something like that. And yeah, this one's maybe not a complete thought process, but it's still useful. And then finally, number 8, we should bluff because he will have to fold a lot here. This is terrible. I'd score this one really low. And the reason that this one is bad is that, well, your 3s are effectively beating everything that he folds. So it's much closer to a thin value bet on the turn than a bluff. A bluff, as we'll see in lecture 3, is more about getting useful fold equity, getting hands that have a great deal of equity to fold against you, not just ones that are drawing to a couple of outs, or even 6 outs or 10. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed the first lecture of grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School, and yeah, stay tuned for lecture 2. Take a bit of time to digest this material, make sure you're ready, and then when you are, I look forward to seeing you on the next lecture. Bye for now guys.